So they took it to Stevie's studio. Stevie absolutely fell in love with it. Literally on the day, he pulled out his checkbook, put his thumbprint on it. No discount, 25 grand US.
Wow. Welcome to Tales from the Top. So many are striving for success, but how do you define it? What's it really like and what happens when you get there? Join me, Lee Gray, co-founder of Chiron Audio, creators of Ultimate Home Music Systems, and my co-host, Jade Devison, founder of Devison Design, creators of unique luxury environments, as we celebrate the lives and achievements of those who have dared to dream big and have reached incredible heights. We delve into what drives them now, the new challenges that they face, and discuss the unexpected tales from the top. Today's guest is Kim Ryrie. While you may not have heard of the name, you have almost certainly heard of his work. Kim co-created the world's first digital sampling synthesizer, which is one of the most influential musical innovations in the past 100 years. The Fairlight CMI revolutionised music creation and changed the course of popular music forever, shaping the sound of albums by Stevie Wonder, Kate Bush, Peter Gabriel, Michael Jackson, and many, many more. If this wasn't enough, Kim went on to develop digital audio technology designed to raise the quality of audio we hear from loudspeakers, allowing for true high-definition audio in playback, finding its way into Abbey Road studios and in the homes of discerning music listeners all over the world. Kim, welcome to the show.
Hi there.
How are we? You
Yeah,
well?
all good. Sun's coming out here in Sydney after a cold winter. And
Half your luck. All right, Kim, we'll dive straight in. Tell us, what was your earliest memories of being interested in audio?
I'm told that I used to grab onto the side of the radiogram and wiggle my ass whenever there was a record playing. I guess it started then, sort of soon after I'd learned to stand up. But what really triggered it was when I heard Walter Carlos's Switched On Bach record, which was made with the Moog synthesizer. And I just thought it was absolutely fantastic. And at the time, we'd started an electronics magazine. My father had a magazine company, and I'd talked him into starting an electronics magazine because the other magazines were sporting magazines like Rugby League Week, Australian Golf, Australian Cricket, Revs, Motorcycle News, that sort of stuff. So I wanted to do an electronics magazine. And at the time, the only electronics magazine was called Electronics Australia, and my father had a look at all the ads in it and thought, oh, this is a good idea, okay, we'll do an electronics magazine. So we started Electronics Today in 1970 or 71, something like that. And then we soon started overseas editions called in the UK and in France. So it became Electronics Today International, or ETI. You're showing that cover. Our listeners can't see it, but that's the first issue, and that's me on the cover, poking around with an oscilloscope. Yeah. So anyway, but what I managed to, we had a team of a couple of people in the magazine where we designed DIY projects every month. We did about 2 or 3 projects, like build your own amplifier or something like that. And I talked everyone into building a synthesizer for people to make, and they all thought I was completely insane. But because I was the boss's son, I sort of talked them into it. And so we spent...
You could do anything.
I think it took about 10 months to publish all the different modules in the synthesizer. It was called the ETI 4600. And there were thousands.
It's a catchy name.
Yeah, it was an absolute catchy name. I can't remember where it came from. I think because it had 4 oscillators and 6 of something else. Yeah. So there were apparently thousands built over the years, especially in the UK. So there were companies that would sell kits of parts for that. And so, by the end of the...
Who was building them? Who was making these things?
Although it was a DIY project.
What sort of DIYers? Are we talking electronics enthusiasts or music enthusiasts?
No, electronics enthusiasts. It would have been, in the main. So, but we got to the end of that, and I was really frustrated that no matter what I did, I couldn't make natural sounds from it. I just couldn't work out how to get a violin sound or a piano sound or something. And it was about the time that the microprocessor had come out, the 4600 from Motorola. Sorry, that's wrong. It was the 6800, which was an 8-bit microprocessor that ran at 1 megahertz, blinding speed. And so I rang up a school friend of mine. We used to build stuff at school together, Peter Vogel, and said, what are you doing? And he said, oh, not much. What are you doing? Actually, he was doing some video. Colour TV had just started in Australia, and he was building a sort of colorizer thing. And I said, well, do you want to make the world's greatest synthesizer? And he said, well, how's that going to work? And I said, well, these new microprocessor things that have just come out, we could use them. and I had this fantasy that if we just had enough oscillators and enough, voltage controlled amplifiers and format controllers and things like that, and you could program them with the computer, you could surely make a natural sound. So anyway, somehow I convinced him, because we used to do stuff at school with no money, no resources, and somehow we sort of did it anyway. So my grandmother, who lived on the waterfront of Sydney Harbour, in one of the, in her basement in her house was where Lawrence Hargrave used to design kites, and he's a famous sort of Australian. He's on some dollar bills or something somewhere. And this used to be his basement where he designed this stuff. So we opened shop down in the basement, and we didn't have any money, as I said. We had about $300 or $400 between us, so that was what it cost to incorporate Fairlight Instruments, proprietary limited. And we had rooms full of junk that we'd collected over the years, so we called that the capital of the company. And we did things like we'd assemble boards for J-Car and stuff like that, to make pocket money. And I remember there's a photo we had no photographs of this, but there was one photo of me sort of tinkering with a music keyboard that I had upside down, and I noticed it had, on every key, it had a little magnet and a coil on every key, because I was trying to design a touch-sensitive keyboard that actually pushed back on you, to create the dynamics of a keyboard. Wow. And funnily enough, that's about the only photo I've found of our life in that period. We were there for about a year. But someone had introduced us to a guy called Tony Firth, and he said, if you're working on a digital music thing, you should meet this Tony Firth guy who's over in North Sydney. And he'd received a grant from the Arts Council of Australia to develop a digital synthesizer for the Canberra School of Music, which was intended as a sort of educational thing where you could create a waveform out of harmonics. So Tony had worked at Fairchild in America for some years, and he'd come back to Australia, and he was Motorola's consultant on microprocessors. So this was very handy. But he'd already developed this dual processor architecture using two Motorola 6800, 1 megahertz processors, and they both shared a common memory which ran at 2 megahertz. So on one cycle, one processor could write or read from the memory, and on the other cycle, the other one. So this way we avoided the very time-consuming issue of interrupting the processor, which in those days took a long time before the processor could sort of do anything else. So Tony had come up with this architecture. It was fantastic. He'd also designed a little graphics display controller thing, and a floppy disk controller. Although not at first. At first, you had to boot this thing up from punched paper tape, and it would take an hour to boot the computer. There was about a reel that was about a foot in diameter of punch paper that sort of rolled on the floor, and if you trod on the paper in the process of it booting, that was seriously bad. You'd have to start again. So this was the first. This was Tony's first processor, and he was running out of time. He'd got a bit of money from the grant to do this, but he was not finished. He couldn't finish it. He had other work that he was supposed to do. So when we turned up, it was a win-win, because it was like, oh well, you could take this over and deliver something to the Canberra School of Music, which he was committed to do. Yeah. And we inherited, a working microprocessor platform in the process, which had already been constructed in a way that let you read waveform memory, but very small amounts. That was only like 4 kilobytes of memory. So we had a huge jump from Tony's original design. And it's fair to say the Fairlight would not have happened without Tony's thing, because my idea was completely ridiculous. It turned out to be the Prophet 5 ended up using which came out about 5 years later or 6 years later, which was what I intended originally when I talked to Peter. So, So
just going back a bit, I mean, you talk about the display. I mean, this was revolutionary in its own right, wasn't it? This was the pen-activated...
Yeah, the light pen. That one,
light pen.
The photo you got up there, that's a Series 3 actually. That was a later model that didn't use the light pen. It used that little pad with a pen on the left. If you find if you find another shot of the Fairlight with a green display, that's it there on the right. And you can see the light pen sort of hanging up there.
So was that designed by him? This was brand new.
No. We designed all that. But yeah, he had a version of the light pen. So, but that was not his physical design. So
you designed the light pen.
That light pen was a purchased item actually.
Right.
But we built the monitor. You couldn't buy monitors, so we got this guy to blow the glass. And I used to go and argue. With the guy that the green phosphor of the last batch was different green from the latest batch. Wow. Forget about colour. This was just green. And the keyboard, you can see the alphanumeric keyboard. We bought the switches from Honeywell. Every switch was individual. It's a Hall effect magnetic switch.
So you made every key on the keyboard?
Every key on the keyboard. I had to get the key tops engraved by an engraver, up in North Sydney.
Wow.
And, what you're seeing there, that photo, is all those vertical lines, they're little faders, and the light pen winds the level of each fader up and down. They're harmonic levels. So the leftmost fader is the fundamental, and then the next one across is the second harmonic, third, and so on. I think we did up to, the early model would do up to 32 harmonics. And then I thought, oh, well, hang on. And all that did was create one cycle with a given harmonic content. And this is what the Canberra School of Music was interested in, and that's what Tony had come up with. And then I thought, well, hang on. This all sounds incredibly boring, because you could wind the harmonics up and down, but it just sounded incredibly electronic and absolutely unusable musically. So I thought, well, we could create once, and by the way, one cycle was like 128 bytes long, and this is 8-bit bytes. So one cycle, so you just repeated that just went in a circle, and that's how you got the harmonics. So I thought, well, why don't we just animate these, right? Because we could fit, we had, 4K of RAM, not 4 meg, 4K. So we could fit, dozens of waveforms, and we could sort of animate them. So we drew, so you could draw a curve of how the fundamental moved in time, and then you could draw in how the second harmonic moved in time, and the third. And that was vaguely interesting. But again, it was too synthetic, still very, it was made a lot of interesting sounds, but not organic sounds by any means. And then a 16K bit memory chip was announced. The dynamic RAM chip came out, and I just said to Peter, "This is unbelievable. 16K bits on a chip." And we could, if we had 8 of them, we could have 16K bytes. And 16K is so much memory that we could sample a real natural sound into that.
So you must have felt like the kings of digital data. It must have been
this was incredible.
At
this was
that time.
Overwhelming amount of memory,
Yeah.
So Peter went off. He didn't muck around, Peter. Within about a week, we had a prototype. He'd redesigned the entire audio management, the waveform memory management system onto one circuit board. Prior to this, by the way, we had something like 16 different circuit boards. Each circuit board was, can I talk in inches? It's about 8 inches square. And there was about 16 of those. And then they plugged into a big motherboard at the back. And each circuit board did a different function 8 times. So one would be, the target register board, and another one would be the attack ramp board and so on. So we thought, no, and then one would be the graphics controller, one would be the light pin controller, one would be the dual processor, one would be the RAM and that sort of thing. So we managed to design the 8 functions all onto one circuit board. So all we need now, we had 8 circuit boards that were all the same, which was, of course, a huge advance.
Yeah.
It's sort of a manufacturing term. So that made it all more viable. And each board had its own 16K of memory. So we'd gone from 8 kilobytes of memory that was shared between 8 channels to 16 kilobytes times 8 channels. So that meant we could have a different sound.
It's a step change
on each of the cards. And we actually, to get the pitch of the memory, all we did was we just ran the sample rate at different sample rates depending on what key you were pressing. Okay, so if you wanted a high pitch, the sample rate would be about 200 kilohertz. And if you wanted a low, so an octave below would be 100 kilohertz, below that 50, below that 25, below that 12. So we're now moving with sample rates in the audio band. Okay, so the sample rate was actually 12 kilohertz, for example, or even less. So we had to have a tracking filter, a tracking low-pass filter that cleaned away all of those switching frequencies above what's called the Nyquist rate, and so that when you hit a bass note, you only heard the bass frequencies. You didn't hear all the high frequency switching. So I mean, this is sort of unheard of in terms of horrifically nasty in today's terms. But we would sell these things for $25,000 back in 1980.
That's incredible.
Wow. So back in 1980, a VBVC Commodore was about $2,500, $3,000. So
is that right? Yeah.
That's a family sedan. That's 10 times a family sedan.
Right. And we couldn't make enough of these, right? So we ended up with 100 people working in Rushcutters Bay. We had 2 floors of a big building. There was no such thing as contract manufacturing, so we had to do everything ourselves. We had to get the circuit boards made. We didn't make the circuit boards. There was an Australian manufacturer of double-sided circuit boards in those days. It was pretty terrifying to use them in terms of quality, but it did work eventually. We had our own sort of ultrasonic cleaning system that used these ozone depleting chemicals. It was all just absolutely horrendous in retrospect, but it was it was fun at the time.
So just so you can explain how the Fairlight worked, you would actually record real sounds and then you were
I'm
digitally
sorry.
sampling them?
Yeah. I'm sorry, I missed the rather important part. Peter designed an A to D analog to digital converter.
Yep.
And we just plugged the microphone into that and made a sound. And depending on what sample rate you chose when you did the sample, this determined how long that sample could be. You could sort of do, with a sample rate of, say, 32K, you got half a second of sample, which doesn't sound like much, but it's amazing what you can do with it when you do tricks like sustain areas of the waveform and so on, and you add attacks and decays and you could do portamento, frequency gliding and all this sort of stuff. So these were all the features that we're able to add in software. And by the way, anyone that could write 2 lines of code pretty much got employed in our software department. Yeah. Because there weren't. This is pre-Apple. I mean, Apple was.
So you're writing in DOS then, I suppose.
We were writing in assembler. There was no DOS.
So that predates everything I know then.
Yeah, no. This was DOS is we had. I'm just trying to think of the name. It was a industrial operating system that we managed to buy the source code for, and modified it. It was a real-time operating system. I can't remember I think it was called QDOS or MDOS or something like that. And by having the source code, it meant when we had bugs in it, we were able to fix that ourselves, because at the time it was impossible to get, for instance, when Microsoft had software doing Office work, it was completely and utterly incapable of doing anything in real time that you could rely on in terms of making music or sound at all. So, and it was one of the reasons that Fairlight ran into trouble later on, because our R&D department, and by then we had about 25 people in R&D, about 10 of them were doing video and about 15 were doing audio. And because we also introduced some of the first video effects products, but I'll get distracted. So...
It's hard when you've achieved so much, isn't it, Kim?
Well, it wasn't me. It wasn't. I can assure you it wasn't me.
Just to bring it into layman's terms, so to put it in context. So we've gone from the Moog, which is analog synth, which is making interesting electronic sounds, to now completely reinventing the wheel, where we can record any sound from nature instruments. That's right. We can sample that to a length of half a second. Yeah. And so we've got something that's gone from strange 60s space noises to a synthesizer that we recognise today. And so what was the first sound that you recorded? Yeah, well, while we were developing this thing, someone said, if you're into synthesizers, you should meet Michael Carlos, who had come to Australia from America with the band Tully, and the government tried to stop them coming into Australia because they'd had marijuana, bust in America. And they were the band for Hair back in the day. Yeah. And anyway, Michael was in the band Tully. He later managed to get a permanent residency in Australia. He couldn't stand America. This was back in he had the Vietnam Day syndrome and all of that. And he was an incredibly bright guy and a music composer, and he ended up doing a fair bit of film music work in Australia. And someone said, you should meet Michael because he's got a Moog synthesizer in Sydney. And so we met Michael, and I think at the time he was the musical director of Jesus Christ Superstar, the first Harry Miller Jesus Christ Superstar. And
that was John English, I think, was in that.
Yeah, John English.
That one
was what's his face?
He was the front
the
man.
bad guy.
Pontius Pilate.
No. John English was My 8-bit memory is failing me.
Well, mine's a one flint memory.
Anyway, so after that, he'd been doing film music, and the trouble with doing film music is your critical path to a movie hitting the streets. You know, everything else is done, the film's edited, and suddenly you've got to come up with a soundtrack for it. And if you're a sort of creative person like Michael who needs to get everything right, it's
Judas Iscariot.
sorry,
That's right.
Yeah. How could I forget? You know.
Yeah, sorry to bust in there. It was bugging me. I had to get it.
Yeah. So anyway, so Michael, when I met him, was really stressed out because he was doing a film for the ABC at the time. I think it was Storm Boy or something like that, and he was fascinated with what we were doing. And anyway, we over the months we were good friends. So we had the prototype of the sampler working, and we brought it over to Michael's house and said, "Hey, check this out." And he said, "What does it do?" I said, "Well, you can sample any sound into it and play it onto this little keyboard that we've thrown together." And he had a dog, and you could tell the dog to speak and it would bark. And that was the first sort of formal sample that Michael's dog bark. And it went into the Fairlight sound library, and it's been used on a lot of albums, actually. That was the first sample.
Fantastic. As has so many iconic sounds, anything from the 80s. I mean, it really is incredible how you changed it. It's like that, was it the orchestral hit?
Yeah.
That was just used in everything, so much so that songs were written about, I'm not going to use this orchestral hit sound because everybody was using it so much.
Yeah, that was
I'm going to show you.
That was from the Firebird Suite. Yeah.
Right, the opening chord.
Opening chord of the Firebird Suite. Yeah.
Bit of Stravinsky.
So speaking of performers, you've obviously, everyone's used it, but I just want to show you this, and for the viewing audience.
Okay.
Yeah, Jade's got a new toy. He can share screen.
I've got a new
He's just
toy.
worked out how to do it, everyone. So that's why we're getting
I'm
these
picking up-
interjections.
You should make
I'm
this.
showing you a
could make this a
picture.
YouTube channel now.
Yeah, I think we're
Could
going
make,
to have to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this young lady that I'm showing to Lee and Kim now, one of my favourite performers of all time, Kate Bush.
Yeah.
So in 1983, she was quoted as to saying that, when was it? I first was going to buy the Fairlight. I was really worried because it cost so much money. So 1983, it was about £18,000, she says, but I haven't regretted it at all. I'm really pleased with it. It's been a great inspiration to me. You must have had a lot of accolades like that. And with Kate Bush, I mean, tell me about Kate Bush and your association with her and how she managed to find out about this.
She would have come across it through Psychosystems in London, and when Peter took the first prototype Fairlight to Los Angeles, and we had a friend there called Bruce Jackson, who at the time he'd grown up next to my house in Point Piper. I mean, next to the house where we had the basement. And Bruce started a company in Australia called Jans, which was Bruce Jackson and Story. That's how
Another legendary company.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
So Bruce taught me how to solder. He was like 4 or 5 years older than me, and we virtually grew up there. And so after Jans, he left Jans and went to work in America for a company called Clare Brothers, who did all the big outdoor sound gigs. And they were doing Elvis's sound, for example. And one day Elvis's sound guy was sick or something, and there was an outdoor concert, and they said to Bruce, "Can you do this concert for Elvis?" And he said, "Yeah, of course." So
As you do.
as you do, and he was.
Mum is doing a roast lamb, but hey, what the hell?
He could take anything on, and but at the end of it, he said, "Elvis, really, you sound like shit. I'm sorry to say, and really, we should look And of course, everyone says, I would imagine, just no one spoke to Elvis like that, right? So he loved it because no one would tell him the truth except Bruce, you know. And so Bruce worked on his sound and got him sounding really good. Anyway, long story short, you know, he was full-time with Elvis for many years, and Elvis bought him an aeroplane for his birthday, you know, that sort of thing. So anyway, when we had the prototype in 79, I rang up Bruce and said, listen, we've got this thing and you can play any sound on it, and do you think anyone would be interested in buying it? These were sort of things we didn't think about, you know, at first, you know. and it was so expensive to make that he said, what do you mean it can play any sound? I said, well, you just make a sound into it and then you play it on the keyboard. He said, you can't be serious. So he said, we'll bring it over. So Peter took it over, and it just managed to fit into his aeroplane with the two of them, Peter and Bruce.
This is one that Elvis bought him.
This is the one that Elvis bought him. And but
great story.
And then but Bruce said, look, you should there's a couple of people I want to show it to. One is Geordie Hormel, who owned the Village Recorder Studios in Los Angeles, one of the biggest studios there at the time, and Stevie Wonder, who's recording Secret Life of Plants. He might be interested in that. So they took it to Stevie's studio. Stevie absolutely fell in love with it. Literally on the day, pulled out his checkbook, put his thumbprint on it. No discount, 25 grand US. But there was another guy, and I've forgotten his name at the moment, who was in the studio when Stevie was getting the demo. He said, I've got to tell Peter Gabriel about this. So he rang up Peter Gabriel, like literally on the spot. Said, you've got to see this thing. This is a thing, can play any sound and blah. So Peter said, well, I wonder if you could organise getting it over to London for me to have a play with. So some months later, Peter took it to London, to Peter's Gabriel studio, and Peter, of course, also bought it straight away. And Peter's nephew, a guy called Stephen Payne, said, look, what about we set up a company here, and we'll be, if Fairlight let us, we'll be the exclusive, you know, UK distributors for this thing.
Is this Geordie?
No, Geordie was that's America, because Geordie also went the same thing from Geordie. Geordie said, if you let me be the exclusive distributor in the States, I'll buy every unit you can buy. What I didn't mention is that Geordie was the heir with his brother of Spam, which is Hormel Meats. It was Geordie Hormel. So that's and Hormel Meats is sort of like half of Minnesota. So Geordie's income was like $250,000 a month or something. And Geordie used to write music for the I Love Lucy show, and had about a 1 acre property at the bottom of Sunset Boulevard in Pacific Palisades. It was all pretty cute. He was across the road from Will Rogers Park, which I don't know if anyone's been there, but it never rained in Los Angeles, and there'd been a huge downpour, and half of Will Rogers Park had come down the hill, gone across Sunset Boulevard and into Geordie's swimming pool. And when I visited Geordie, he had they obviously cleaned up the property, but there was corn growing in the swimming pool. He decided he'd rather grow corn in the swimming pool because no one swam in it anymore. So this is the sort of guy we're dealing with. So anyway, where was I? So to cut a long story short,
you're in a pool with corn, I think.
No. But going back to Peter, back to Psycho Systems in London. That's how Kate Bush would have. And in fact, there's Stephen Payne in that photo you've just put up with Kate to his right. That is Stephen Payne.
Yeah, right.
And getting the demo. They did a big press conference in London.
He's doing the demo for Peter Gabriel there as well. So.
Yeah, that's Steve. They did a put on a big press do, and they'd programmed something. Well, I can't remember it. The bird singing in Barclay Square or something. What's that tune?
Vera Lynn,
Yeah.
Nightingale sang in Berkeley
Nightingale,
Square.
yeah. So they'd programmed all of that with nightingales and the whole catastrophe in the machine, and invited all the press to this thing, and there was wine and waiters and the whole thing, and it was very full on. And they got a huge amount of press. They were good at doing that sort of thing. Psychosystems. They had a nice office in Paddington there.
Yeah.
I just want to highlight how humble Kim is. You know, we had a pre-interview to this one, and I asked him about the Kate Bush track, Running Up the Hill, which, you know, most people would know right now is one of the highest selling albums. And first of all, he said, I can't remember if it was a Fairlight that she used.
Yeah.
But then I researched the song a bit further, and this is the quote that I found, Jade, and what was it? From Kate Bush. Regarding the types of sounds you get, how did you get that little part in Running Up the Hill? And she said, that comes in first at the start of the song, after the drums, before the vocals, sorry. And that's a Fairlight. And that was actually what I wrote the song with, and that's what I wrote the song around. So she based that entire song around that instrument. And Kim wasn't even aware of that.
Yeah, well, we were lucky. We had a lot of really creative people, and obviously they tended to be the successful ones because they needed to have the money to pay for this thing, and they were all really very easy to get on with, just really nice, creative people. So it was a terrific time, and they gave us a lot of feedback on, you know, it'd be good if we could do this, and you know that. So we did whatever we could in terms of, you know, adding features. Obviously, to the extent, you know, the technology let us do it in those days. And then over the years, there was the first CMI. It's called CMI, Computer Musical Instrument, because I didn't want to use the word synthesizer because to me that had too much electronic baggage attached to it. So I wanted to, and well, see, also we had, because it was a computer, we were able to do a sequencer. And so we sort of also had the first sequencer where you could just play stuff on the keyboard and then edit that. And Michael Carlos, who I mentioned to you with the dog, came into the office one day, not long after that actually, and said, can I borrow I'm sort of interested in learning how to program. Can I borrow some documentation that would teach me how to program? So we gave him all the stuff we could sort of lay our hands on, because we knew he was an incredibly bright guy, and it would be fantastic to have an actual composer writing stuff, you know, software-wise. And literally only like 2 months later, he came in and said, here, try this. And so he brought a floppy disk with him. This was before hard disks, of course. There were only 8-inch floppy disks. Put in the floppy.
You imported the first one, right?
Floppy disk, pretty much.
Yeah.
We would have certainly, I don't know about that for sure, but we certainly would have had some of the first floppy disk drives. Mm-hmm. And actually there's another story behind that, because before we'd even finished the music instrument, we were trying to make money to sort of fund the development. So this would have been mid-70s, and Remington office machines came to us and said, look, we understand you're making, you know, sort of the only Australian computer, and we want to sell an Australian business computer. And I said, well, we don't know anything about business. And
that's when they thought, let's get the contracts arranged really quickly.
Yeah, exactly. So he said, no, don't worry about that. We'll write the program for the business, but can you give us the computer? So we did we made up a system which was a desk, you know, with a monitor on it, but they needed, I think it was a megabyte of memory, which was like an impossible amount of memory. And the only way you could do it, at the time, one 8-inch floppy disk could do 128 bytes per side. But they just brought out a new drive. A company called Shugart had brought out a drive that could do both sides of the disc, which meant you got 1/4 megabyte on one
Wow.
disc, which meant if we had 4 of them, we had
No
a
way.
megabyte.
Yeah.
And so we got this Namco to come up with some office furniture for us that held 4 of these drives in one side of the desk. And that was all fine and dandy until we discovered that when you wrote on one side of the disc, sometimes it would write through to the other side of the disc, right?
Translucent.
Causing absolute catastrophic corruption of data. And so I obviously was freaking out, and I got onto Shugart and said, listen, this is completely ridiculous. We're selling to Remington office machines, and this needs to work. And the other problem was that it would scratch the oxide off these new heads would literally rip the oxide over time. Didn't take long, and the oxide would literally start disappearing off the disc. Well, then we discovered an IBM floppy disk that this didn't happen on, so that was a good improvement. But it was still occasionally corrupting the other side of the disc. So anyway, then Shugart said, "Oh no, we have discovered a modification that fixed the problem." But we've decided to stop manufacturing the disc, because we were one of their only customers at this stage. And I said, well, you can't do that. We're committed. We've got to deliver 100 of these computers.
Yeah.
And we'd have to take legal action and all this sort of drama.
Oh, jeez.
And they said, well, the modification is a hand modification we've got to do onto the heads. And anyway, the long story short, they did restart production just for us. For these disk drives. And within about 6 months, a Japanese company brought out a new double-sided drive, which was absolutely sensationally fantastic, beautifully built, and even more reliable. So we ended up changing to that. So I just get distracted again. But this is sort of some of the learning curve, of how to make computers reliable, which was by the time the Fairlight came out, which was probably a year or two after that little episode, it was pretty bulletproof. We'd managed to make, because, see, people weren't used to computer bugs. They'd never heard of, because they weren't used to computers, so they weren't used to the idea that things just don't work sometimes, and they didn't like it. And whereas now we just deal with it, on a daily basis. In those days, they were even less. So it's why we had to have our own operating system that we could fix bugs very quickly. We had people like Jean-Michel Jarre doing world tours with his Fairlight.
Yes.
And if the thing died on stage, it would be
Tubular bells all of a sudden becomes...
complete catastrophe.
Actually, this is probably a good time to tell you a Kubrick story, if you want to talk about a catastrophe, right?
Yeah. So, well, I was a Kubrick fanboy, big time. I'd seen 2001 about 2001 times, and and one day I got home and there was a message on my message machine saying, "Is this Kim Ryrie place? So this is Stanley Kubrick. Could you give me a call, please?" So I'm sort of shaking, and So I called back and it was his direct line. I went straight through to him. And he said, I'm just calling to check to see if you've got another Fairlight about to come out, because we wanted to use the Fairlight in a movie we're doing. My daughter is going to do the soundtrack. And Vivian Kubrick. And I said, no, we haven't got anything coming out anytime soon. And so... long story short, they bought a unit, and I think it would have been 6 months later or something. I was in London, asleep, in a hotel somewhere, and the phone rang at 2 or 3 in the morning, and I answered it, and there's this hysterical woman on the phone. So, is this Kim? And oh, this is Vivian Kubrick, and I've got a problem. My Fairlight's not working, and I've got rushes in the morning, and can you help?" And I didn't even know where I was. I'm thinking, this is completely incredible. So anyway, I worked out what she'd been doing. After 5 minutes, we sorted it out, and that was that. And then about 2 days later, she rang back and said, "Oh, look, thanks so much for that. It was all worked out fine, and it was great, and everyone loved it, and so on." And what are you doing?
What was the film, Kim?
Full Metal Jacket.
Right.
And she said, "Could you look? This weekend is Daddy's birthday. Do you want to come?" And I said, "I can't come. I've got a trade show opening in New York. 2 days." So I never got to meet my all-time hero.
Oy vey.
Oh, that's got to be a regret. Trade show versus meeting Kubrick.
Yeah, no, that was very sad.
Oh, dear.
Yeah.
Today's episode is sponsored by us, Chiron Audio and Devison Design.
At Chiron, we enrich people's lives with music systems that create lifelike three-dimensional images that evoke real emotional responses and allow true connection to recorded music. With our strategic partners, we can help you create the ultimate environment to enjoy your Chiron music system. From interior design guidance through to an entire bespoke listening room, we can assist you to bring your dream to life. Life is better with music, and music is better with Chiron.
Devison Design creates luxury garage environments for the discerning automotive collector, preserving your collection in surroundings that are more gallery than garage, and so enhancing the value of your enjoyment. With projects across Australia and Europe, Devison Design provides design services worldwide. Truly bespoke garages start with inspiring designs. Let Devison Design inspire you.
To get in touch with one of our principals directly, visit our website, chironaudio.com.au or devisondesign.com.au to book a consultation.
And now on with the show.
I just want to highlight just quickly too, because Kim will never tell you, but just so you understand, so the amount of people that used the Fairlight, it changed the sound of the 80s and music that came after that. So I'm just going to read a really short list of some of the people that used it. So we've got Michael Jackson, Herbie Hancock, Kate Bush, Stevie Wonder, Peter Gabriel, Hans Zimmer, Duran Duran, Devo, Yello, Prince, Def Leppard, Frankie Goes to Hollywood, Led Zeppelin, The Art of Noise, Queen, Joni Mitchell, Pet Shop Boys, Icehouse, ZZ Top, Fleetwood Mac. And that is a tiny tip of the iceberg. So there's no one on this planet that would not have heard, the sounds that the Fairlight made. And I don't think you can underestimate how it changed the entire landscape of music.
Yeah,
amazing.
We were just incredibly lucky. We were sort of the only show in town in a way, in terms of where there was talent, people that wanted to learn to program and stuff like that. They'd come to us because we were.
That's true, but you're humble, right? You took the bravery, and for some reason, the reason that two guys, in Grandma's shed, said, "Hey, let's build the world's best synthesizer." Full tip of the hat. But it's incredible.
It is funny that we were just so arrogant that we would do that.
I don't know if it's arrogance.
Was it arrogance, or was it a concept that you basically, why can't we do it? And just had a go?
Look, it's
a lot like Lee has done with his speakers. I mean, gee whiz, a very similar story.
Look, I think that it's looking back, it's just a whole lot of coincidences and meeting the right people, because it sure wouldn't have happened if we hadn't lucked into the right people like Tony First, people like Michael Collar. So I was just about to tell you the story of Michael. So that Michael with the dog and, the composer. So we went to a trade show in New York, and Michael was with me, and we booked a room in the hotel where there was an audio trade show on. No, the audio engineering show it was. So we were introducing this thing for the first time. And this guy came in, and a guy called Roger Lynn, and he had this little box with him, and he said, "Oh, look, this is a prototype. It's a prototype drum machine that I've come up with, and I've just got some people I'd love to demo it. Would it be okay if I plugged it into your mixer just to do a quick demo? So I said, yeah, sure. So he plugged it in, and this is the first drum machine, right? And so you press things, and I'm going, wow, look at this. This is amazing. And so anyway, I said, look, if you like, you can stay. You can do a show every half hour. We'll do it on the half hour, you know. And so he was able to, you know, get quite a few people interested in that. But meanwhile, I've got more evil thoughts going on, which is, why don't we do this, you know? So, and of course, Michael was there too. And so we talked about doing what we call the rhythm sequencer. We called it Page R. I should have mentioned that with the Fairlight, every page had a letter, you know, like Page R was a rhythm sequencer and Page something else was something else. It was about 10 right. different pages of different things. And so what you could do was you could just put not only drums, of course, you could put any instrument in our case, and you could program them, and it would default the hit to a certain rhythm quantize that you could set. You know, the resolution of the quantizing of the rhythm. So this software, it sort of to the Fairlight became, and this was quite early on. This was really the first year of release. Michael managed to get the first release of Page R out, I think it was, and it was like what VisiCalc was to Apple. You know, VisiCalc was the first spreadsheet, and right. and everyone thought Apple, you know, computers were fine and dandy, but it wasn't until the spreadsheet came out that everyone thought, oh, well, actually now I've got to have one of these, you know, because now I can do spreadsheets. Well,
now it's a practical application.
Exactly, and that's a bit like what Page R was to the Fairlight, because suddenly it became very easy to put down your backing tracks. You could,
right.
And Michael, being a composer, of course, just made this sensational bit of software that made composition, you know, just leapfrog ahead in terms of the sort of things you could try and edit on the fly and so on.
Yeah.
So that was Page R.
And then Fairlight somehow morphed into video. How did that come about?
Yeah. So one of the programmers was a guy that we had doing the programming on the Fairlight, a guy called Keir Silverbrook, and Keir came to me one day and said, look, I've got an idea for a video product called the Collider Pen. Would it be okay if I used the facilities, you know, after hours to work on a prototype? And I said, yeah, you know, of course. So a couple of months later, he came up and showed me this thing where you took the light pen, or a light pen, and you sort of drew it on any TV set, and it would do kaleidoscopic images, and you could set the colour and do all this, and you could draw, you know, butterflies and all that sort of stuff easy. And he had this idea that you could that he could make these things for you know, X $100. And I said, Keir, that's all great, but I'm getting bored. You know, after about a minute and a half, I'm starting to get bored with this idea. Why don't you organise a real-time video input? Oh, that's a good idea. Okay. So he went off, you know, 2 weeks later, we've got video coming in, and you could draw kaleidoscopic images over the top of that. And then we thought, he'd organised a way of colorising the images so you could do different effects, and you could animate, you know, you could freeze frame live effects. And then we thought, well, actually, we really want 2 live images coming in, so we added a second video input. Long story short, this turned into a thing called the computer video instrument. So we had the computer musical instrument, the CMI, and now we had the CVI. So you could do all sorts of quite fun effects with this thing. Not at full resolution, not at sort of broadcast resolution, but I think the first resolution of the digital images was only like 250 by 250 something very low res like that. And we were selling those boxes for doing music. For instance, the ABC TV bought them, and they were using them to do some of their video effects. Even though it was low res, it was still, and we sold them. It was quite cheap. That's the unit there you've got up on the screen. Yeah. And we did a sort of disco version where people could have them in discotheques and so on. And that was doing quite well. It wasn't very expensive. We sold them for, I don't know, it was like a couple of $1,000. It was not ridiculously expensive like the music machine. And then I received by post, this is about a year or two later, this huge box full of patents that had arrived from Ampex in America with a legal letter saying, we think you might be infringing some of our patents.
Right. Cease and desist.
So, but don't worry, because we're happy to license, all these patents. And they reckon we were infringing, about 10 patents or something. And it was going to cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to do all that. And then I realised that the description of every patent referred to broadcast quality, and there is a standard for broadcast quality video. So I wrote back and said, look, I don't think we are actually, because we don't have a broadcast quality video product. And that was the last we heard from them.
Oh, brilliant.
So that was quite fun.
The Fairlight went on to be major video editing platform,
yes,
right?
but that was not through us. That was what happened ultimately, was that Fairlight was bought by a company in Melbourne called Black Magic, and Black Magic's their skill was in video, high definition video. They literally made
beautifully designed products.
Fabulous cameras and stuff, but they wanted to integrate. We didn't really talk about post production, because we also by about 87, 88, we had the first hard disk recorder. By now we had hard disks, and we worked out how to do hard disk recording, and there wasn't much of that around. In fact, there was virtually none of it around. And I
such pathfinders.
Yeah, well, it's just that people came to us because we had the technology, and they sort of suggest, well, you can do that. Why can't you do this for post production?
Right.
And especially things like Foley sound effects. We started off doing stuff like that. We had a guy in Germany who made porno movies. He
needed some sound
effects. He found a use for it.
What sort of stuff? No.
I'm serious. He needed the series.
I would love to have seen his keyboard.
He had a Series 3. By the time of the Series 3, you could record about 10 seconds on one key, So
that's long enough.
And that was 16-bit.
That's like a big night.
So anyway, we digress a bit.
I don't know. We fell off the rails there.
Definitely fell off the rail.
There's always one.
So so Black Magic wanted to integrate So I should just go back. So we started Fairlight Instruments. We stopped making the keyboard. They were just that all sort of went bad by the end of there was a recession in 88, and our only competitor in America, a company called Sinclair, had raised about I think $6 or $8 million in capital, and despite the recession, they were able to keep selling their machines because they were funding the leasing of it unsecured to studios and things. And we couldn't do that. We had offices in New York, we had office in Los Angeles and so on, and the overheads were horrendous. And so that ran into serious financial problems. We stopped making the musical instrument because it was uncompetitive, because we weren't able to we weren't able quickly enough to move away from our proprietary very robust computer platform to a PC or a Mac platform. It was just that were all very unreliable, I should say. And our guys just sort of didn't want to do it, and they kept, anyway, that didn't work. So bottom line, I thought, okay, we'll move into post-production, because at the moment they're editing soundtracks on sprocketed magnetic film, which was just completely insane. You know,
We're literally talking cutting room floor, right?
well, cutting room floor. I don't know if you've seen a dubber room for instance, if you go into Paramount or Sony Pictures, any of those big film things where they're mastering the soundtracks. There's a room of what they call dubbers, and each dubber is like a big rack mount unit with 35mm film on it, sprocketed film, but instead of film, it's magnetic film. And each dubber recorded about 6 audio tracks typically on one film. And so you might have 10 to 15 of these machines in a row, and they're all synchronised together. So if one sprocket moved, every machine moved by the same amount using these things called Selson motors, which was another miraculous invention of the day. So and I thought, well, this is crazy. Why don't we, we could do this digitally, using object-based editing. And by now, Michael Carlos had become a great programmer for us, and he, he and others were working in we called this company Fairlight ESP, which was Fairlight Electric Sound and Picture. And so it was focused on post-production rather than music production. So we were able we managed to get about 8 continuous audio tracks running from a single hard disk, which in those days was quite an achievement. And by then we had a 16-channel Fairlight, the model, the Series 3 Fairlight had 16 channels, 16-bit audio, lots of buffer memory. And so each track could run just out of RAM, I can't remember how long, but something like 10 seconds of audio independently of what you could get off the hard disk. So the industry was used to 24-track recorders. So I thought, well, why don't we make a post-production digital audio workstation that had 24 tracks, even though there's a lot of smoke and mirrors involved, namely that you can only ever play 16 tracks at a time, because we only had 16 channels based on the old Series 3, and
you didn't see anything.
Yeah, and you could only sustain the equivalent of 8 audio tracks continuously, right? But for post-production, that wasn't really a problem, because sound effects tended to only be, a couple of seconds. The only things that used continuous sound were either ambience and stereo soundtracks. So there might have been maybe 4 continuous tracks, but the rest were dialogue tracks and sound effects and stuff.
Hence why this was so good for Foley.
Yeah, and Foley, but you could literally do a whole film soundtrack on one of these machines. Certainly, you could do video, for TV. You could certainly manage it on that. For doing really feature films, you'd need, say, 3 machines, 24 tracks each. One would be Foley.
Is this the first? Sorry, is this the first digital video editing machine?
No, this didn't. Digital audio, yes, at that scale, that's right. So, and that used object-oriented editing, where you could see the waveform scrolling across the screen, and they would synchronise with the video or the film. So this was pretty revolutionary in the day, and we were selling these for $100,000 each. And we sold them. We had most of Hollywood. We had Paramount, Sony Pictures, Todio, Glen. NHK in Japan had like 20 of them, something like that. Stuff like this. So
that would have been a great day when they ordered that.
No. This happened over time.
Okay.
And And then we added consoles to that, mixing consoles, and so that was how that all developed. So that was Fairlight's post-production stuff. Peter wasn't involved in the second stage of the Fairlight. He was a bit burnt out, after the first time by '88. So we all the core R&D guys. He helped me get started with Fairlight ESP, but he just wanted to just take time off and head to the hill.
Yep.
So we had the key R&D guys come across. We kept working on software upgrades for the music instruments that were still in the field. There were a lot of them. So that generated income for us while we worked on the post-production product. And then ultimately that is what Black Magic bought, that IP, as that ended up on PC platforms, and then they integrated it with their, sensational.
What year was that, Kim? Because I didn't realise Black Magic had been around that long.
Yeah, they. Look, good question. I think they took it over at least 10 years ago, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. So this wasn't back in the 80s.
No. This is relatively recent stuff.
Right. Okay,
Yeah.
cool. And then while all this was going on, you just decided that you're going to reinvent the way loudspeakers work.
Yeah,
right?
well,
and you've come to your latest
Well,
venture.
what happened was we had VCs involved in. They started getting involved in the older company, and I was trying to get them to move everything down onto the PC platform, and they didn't want to do it. They wanted to stay with the thing, and I said, "Well, look, this is really you can't do that. You'll come a cropper because there's going to end up being too much competition from companies like DigiDesign and so on."
Yeah.
And they thought, oh no, there'll always be a high end market. And I saw what happened in the music industry, and I just thought the same is going to happen to post production, which of course it did. And so that's why, that's why I decided I wanted to do something else. And and what had happened, one of our programmers, a guy called Brian Conley from many years earlier, contacted me, and he'd started a company called Lake DSP, and they developed this headphone technology that made you think when you're wearing headphones that the sound was coming from outside of your head. And he invited me over to see that and said, "Look, what are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm working with Fairlight, but I'm ready to do something new." And he said, "Well, can you help us commercialise this out-of-head headphone stuff?" And I said, "Yeah, I could sort of do a week on, week off. Would that work?" And he said, "Yeah, that'd be fine." So we looked at this, and then they developed this stuff called long convolution finite impulse response to do this out-of-head. Sound familiar? So, and I was amazed at what this could do, and he showed me a demo that they'd done with a little speaker. It was a little car speaker, and they'd measured the errors that it was doing in the time domain and played that back, and I was amazed that the improvement was wasn't unbelievable, but it was certainly noticeable. And and this was using a chip that had been developed by the CSIRO. I think it was called the A250 or something like this in hardware. And they developed it with an idea that they could use it for car audio, but it turned out to be not long enough taps. There was, only 250 taps. You can't do that much with that. And it was quite expensive, and car audio people don't want to pay any money for anything. So that didn't pan out, but they took the technology. He started his own company with Lake and another guy called Dave McGrath, and Dave was one of these geniuses that developed the algorithms to do the out-of-head headphone technology. And
so in layman's terms, what is this algorithm doing?
So what you do, the way we notice that sound is coming from outside our head is that our ears have a whole lot of filtering going on. The earlobes create, if a sound comes from me from behind, the earlobe creates a different type of filtering than if the sound had come from in front. The fact that I've got two ears also tells me what direction it's come from. So the ear is incredibly sensitive to the most amazingly subtle differences in filtering and so on. It's how we've, it's back in the day when you're about to get jumped on by a bear from behind, you sort of needed to know how it worked. So this is what you did was you put microphones in your ear, in effectively little tiny microphones. They would then measure, then they would create a sound at a certain location in front of you to the right, in front of you to the left, directly in front of you, and then from the rear left and the rear right, for example, like surround sound, left, centre, right, surround left, surround right. Yep. So for each source, you would end up recording a different filter set as the ears hear it. Okay, and this is called an HRTF, a head-related transfer function. So
another catchy term.
So you'd have one which would relate to the front left speaker, for example. You'd have another filter relating to. So you could run these filters using this convolution process and mimic these effects. So.
Right.
So
okay.
I said...
So all of a sudden you've got surround sound inside of your headphones.
Exactly. And so I said, well, you've got to... And they needed money. That was the other thing. They were running out of money. And they said, well, how do we, get some funding for this? I said, well, the first thing you need to do is make a demo. So I wrote a little script with James Bond and Q. And Q was calling James Bond into his laboratory to demonstrate this new technology that the Russians had come up with. That they'd come up with, but the Russians were after, or something like. I can't remember what it was. Anyway, there was this guy in Sydney who could do Sean Connery. You would swear it was him speaking.
But Jane doesn't do a bad Sean
Connery.
And
another guy did Q, right? So we wrote this little script. The script was about 2 minutes long, and James had put the headphones on. Good Lord, Q, I don't believe that. So anyway, long story short, Brian was out in the city and ran into Paul Keating, whose office happened to be next to Lake's office. And Brian drops down to his knees in front of Paul Keating and says, "Oh, how are you, God?" And
for those of us not from Australia, this was our
former Prime Minister. They don't make him. They don't make him like that anymore. I can tell you. So anyway, they started chatting, and Paul said, "Well, what do you do?" "Oh, we did this audio technology, and could we give you a demo or something?" And he said, "Yeah, I'd be interested." So he didn't want to come into the office, but we recorded the demo on a little portable CD player with headphones on it, and got his secretary to leave Paul Keating's secretary to leave it on Paul's desk, and he played the thing. And the next day he'd come into the office next door and said, "Oh, that was unbelievable. Let's show me what you're doing." So. Long story short, Paul introduced them to his mate who had lots of money from Strathfield Car Radios or whatever it was, and he ended up investing in Lake, and Lake ended up going public. They did a deal with Dolby. So Lake headphones is now called Dolby headphones, and Lake is now Dolby Australia. With 200 employees doing.
So that Dolby
stuff.
algorithm, what happened to that algorithm? So is this the Dolby that we see on so many of the devices we have now?
No, that's Dolby, it's literally called Dolby headphones. So if you plug headphones into a product, say a Sony product that has Dolby headphones on it, it will do this out of head effect. When you just play normal audio, it'll sort of seem to come from out of your head.
And what did you do? What did you do with that algorithm, though?
Oh, well, I couldn't. It had nothing to do with me. I was only helping them with their commercialisation. But sorry, yeah. Then, so what I said to them, I said, "This is incredible. You could use this to do speaker correction because I was a failed, loudspeaker designer, pre-Fairlight, pre-everything. And I could never make speakers sound realistic. I just found it incredibly frustrating making passive crossovers and they're never working the way I wanted them to. And we had a band and I got hold of a pair of Voice of the Theatre speakers, the horn speakers that they used in theatres in the day. And we were blowing up the little horn tweeter in these things virtually every week. We blew up a new diaphragm in the horn. But
as every good rock band
exactly.
does.
And they were passive speakers. So there was just a passive, crossover network inside these.
A passive speaker is a speaker without an amplifier.
Exactly. So you just fed it from one amplifier. And then we just built some amplifiers. This was during the days of Electronics Today magazine, and we just finished building 2 little build-it-yourself 100-watt amplifier modules. And I thought, I could do what the pro audio speakers do and make an active speaker out of my Voice of the Theatre speaker. So I put 2 amps, one driving the horn and one driving the bass driver, and that meant I could put steeper filters in front, steeper crossover filters that protected the diaphragm of the horn by a factor of 4 better, which meant we stopped blowing up the horns, and we also, it just sounded way, way cleaner. And I'm thinking, well, hang on, why aren't all speakers built like this, built actively?
Couldn't agree more.
Anyway, that was when I was turned on to active back. That was a long time ago, but then I stopped building speakers for 30 years, and that's what motivated Dex to start. Because when I said to Brian at Lake, you should be using this convolution technology to correct loudspeakers. He said, no, it's all too hard. We've tried it and it does sort of work, but we've got to focus on this headphone stuff. Why don't you do it? And it was when it was sort of good timing for me, because I thought I've sort of had enough of Fairlight by now, and wanted to try something new. And Brian said, and by the way, you should meet Paul Glendenning. He's the best engineer we've had, but he won't work with us because he doesn't like one of our engineers. And we won't tell anyone. So I contacted Paul, and it was a bit like the early days of Fairlight. What are you doing? Oh, not much. What are you doing? Actually, he was doing microwave technology for microwave ovens, and he was a very bright cookie. And I said, well, do you want to start this company and we're going to make speakers sound better? And so that's how we started. That's how we started Dex. That was in 1997, and we didn't really know what we were doing, or I didn't. It was just we were just sort of playing around originally to see where this would lead us, and I thought, this will only take a year or two, it won't be a problem. And of course, it was just 20 years later. We finally got it nearly right. So I think what will happen. I should have explained. We haven't really explained what Dex does, I suppose. Dex, by the way, DEQX stands for Digital Equalisation and Crossover. So that's sort of what we feel is the formula for a truly high-definition loudspeaker that ultimately can be affordable. At the moment, if you want a really great high-definition loudspeaker, it's in the order of $50,000 to a couple of $100,000, using the old technology. What we can do is we can take a really cheap and nasty speaker. A show I just did in Melbourne recently at an audio show where there wouldn't have been a speaker there that was less than thousands of dollars. I brought in a pair of Dayton Audio $150 a pair speakers and showed the difference that you can do by measuring the errors that the speaker makes in the time domain. In other words, what we call time incoherence, or it's called group delay or phase response. And that's where every speaker, because of the electromechanics involved in it, and also the filters involved in passive speaker design, it causes certain frequency groups to be physically delayed in time before you hear them. And the delay is only fractions of a millisecond, or at worst several milliseconds at low frequency. But we notice that. We hear that sounding, hang on, that's not right. That's not real.
If I could put it into super layman's terms, it's if you can imagine the sound coming out of the speaker, you get little bits of the bass, bits of the mids, and it's like a wave coming at you, like it's almost a wave shape, and it all comes at mixed different times. Yep. And what Kim's device does is chops it into thousands of pieces, the frequencies, and then it delays everything to the slowest one. So then all of a sudden, every sound is hitting your ears at exactly the same time. And it's not subtle. The difference is all of a sudden you're hearing, you'll have a 3D soundstage in front of you, from your two speakers, and you'll be able to say, there's the drums over there, there's the violinists, the singer's there and stood up, or she's sat down. All of a sudden, this information that is there on your standard recordings gets revealed. So
because
it is quite incredible.
See, what's great about audio technology over the last couple of decades is that everything's great. It's all gone digital, it's all gone high resolution. Everything's fine and dandy from the recording studio through to mastering, distribution of the media, unless it gets too compressed. And then we get it through to our home system, and then it gets amplified. But when it gets to the loudspeaker, because the loudspeaker is seriously electromechanical compared to everything upstream of it, that's the bit where, like, literally by 2 orders of magnitude, the accuracy of the signal coming into the speaker can get annihilated. And we're so used to hearing that, we just sort of know that what we're listening to is coming out of a speaker, and it's not real, except for the very best systems. And so what we do, as Lee was saying, we literally just delay all the audio by about 10 milliseconds. Sound, by the way, travels about 10 feet in about 1 foot per millisecond. So 10 milliseconds is like 10 feet. So we work out, we've measured which frequency groups a particular speaker has delayed and by how much, and then we delay everything so that we can then glue it all back together again precisely as it should have been.
I had a gentleman here today. We utilise some of Kim's tech in our systems. Yep. And I had a gentleman here leave today. He said, I have to go home and rethink about how I listen to music, and after 73 years of listening. It's quite profound what it can do.
So that journey has been quite huge, Kim, for you, and Lee also for you as well. Kim, where to now? What is happening now?
Well, I think as Lee was saying, we've had to wait for the technology to catch up, and the latest processing. Unfortunately, what's held us back, over the years has been that to do what's called finite impulse response filtering at high resolution requires a huge amount of digital signal processing performance, and digital signal processor chips over the years and that's what we've used in the products to date. They do pretty well, but ideally you want even more processing power. We use, for example, 100 times more processing power than the normal digital audio would use, for instance, to do equalisation and stuff like that. So it's seriously more hungry with processing. But now that you've got ARM processor cores, and especially the later generation ones, which were all designed, of course, for mobile devices, things like iPhones and what have you, their power is just so incredible compared to DSP chips that we had to use in the past. plus the fact that they now talk to the internet. So suddenly all these things are coming together. So, we can do streaming on the same chip that we can do the processing.
Kim, I think we're going to have to leave it there. It's been absolutely wonderful. And if anything, I come away from this just feeling unbelievably proud of what is created right here in Australia. You're humble to a fault. What you've created and reinvented in numerous times throughout your life, and it's just, why don't we just give it a crack? It's quite incredible, and most people don't just do that. It's a very small percentage of the population that have that courage, and then to see it through too. It's not let's just talk about it over the bar. It's you actually get your hands dirty, and sure you're standing on the shoulders of giants yourself and sharing these accolades with others, but your achievements are incredible. And from my wife and I, who are massive 80s fans, thank you so much, because just love those sounds that were created through that era. It's just incredible.
Well, thanks very much. Yeah, no, it's been a pleasure to talk to you all, and I know it's all going to go well with your company and the new speakers that you've been working on, because they sure look pretty good. I haven't heard them yet, but
you will. Thanks, Kim. I really appreciate your time.
Yes.
See you later.
Thanks, Kim. Thanks.
And to the listeners, I hope that you enjoyed that as much as we did. Thanks for listening to the show. And if you'd like to find out more about Chiron Audio or Devison Design and how we can create bespoke luxury environments and experiences in your life, you're more than welcome to book a call with one of our principals through our websites, chironaudio.com.au or devisondesign.com.au, or follow us on our socials. Links are in the description. And we will be back next week with another episode to discover more tales from the top.